When we think of it that way, we're talking about less than 1 million people can really decide the election in certain states. Can a podcast have that persuasive power? Probably could, right? Because it could have motivated certain groups, especially young men, to actually turn out to vote. So I don't want to say that it definitely impacted it, but I think it could, because our elections are so inherently close, our country is so divided, that it really could matter.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
I'm joined today in the ASC Marketing and Communications Studio by Dominik Stecula, Assistant Professor of Communications at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. His research agenda is situated primarily in the fields of political and science communication, and as an interdisciplinary scholar, his work is influenced by and engages with scholarship in political science, public health, and psychology. Dr. Stecula, welcome to Voices.
Thank you so much for having me.
Such an interesting background. I'm always interested in talking with interdisciplinary scholars. Why don't we begin, first of all, by talking about your research interest broadly? That you're sort of interested in where the public gets its information. Say a little more about what that might mean.
Yeah, it's something that really what has gotten me interested in academia in general. I took a media and politics class, and I realized that a lot of the things that we experience is not through direct experience, but it's mediated through the press. And that really is a profound power that they have over us. Trying to understand where people get their information about current affairs and other types of information, and why has been one of the major parts in my research agenda, as well as the impact of that information on people's attitudes about all kinds of things, whether it's politics to climate attitudes and vaccination attitudes, and then ultimately behavior, like actually getting a vaccine.
When we say media today, it strikes me that media today is not what media was maybe even 10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago. When we say media today, what does that mean?
It means so many different things. It's very, very fragmented landscape these days. So we're talking right after the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl had a viewership of, I think, about 150 million. It makes it the highest viewed television program in history. But it is really the only national audience that anything really garners these days. So when we rewind to the, let's say, 80s, right, the media landscape was really, there were your ABC, NBC, CBS News in the evening. Those were 30-minute broadcasts. And if you had the TV on, the news were on, or you had the TV off, right? There wasn't a lot of choice. You couldn't watch like House Hunters or play PlayStation. It was either that or nothing. So a lot of people were kind of forced to take in news and current affairs simply because there was a very low choice media environment, right? Like you had your daily newspaper from your city or maybe a regional newspaper. You had a weekly magazine like Time or Newsweek. And that was it. That was the media landscape. That meant the media were very powerful because a lot of people were tuning into the evening news. The daily newspapers were fairly popular. That meant that they could set the political agenda and really had a profound impact on their audiences. Now we fast forward a bit and all of a sudden you now have cable news, right? Now the calculation changes a bit. You now have a choice and now it's in their interest to kind of tailor to specific groups. You no longer kind of appeal to the median American. You kind of want to carve out your space. So you have things like Fox News kind of coming into shape. And that, over time, has increasing power on our politics. But then internet just changes the game. And starting with the early 2000s, both just internet and websites, but then also a little later on, social media have ultimately just changed how we consume information. And we now think of young Americans as ones on social media. But really, all Americans get most of their news online in some form. Older Americans use YouTube a lot. They use Facebook a lot. In fact, kids, our students don't use Facebook.
That's right. It's an old person's media.
Their parents, their grandparents use Facebook. They are on TikTok. They're on Instagram. So now everybody can get information from their specific nook of the internet. And information, current affairs, competes with all other forms of entertainment. So now you don't have to consume news. You can watch House Hunters International. You can watch reruns of sports. You can play PlayStation. You can just have endless scroll on TikTok, right? So where we get our information now is a very difficult question to answer because it is so varied by which group of people you're thinking about. And it's no longer a national audience anymore, right? Which makes the media in certain ways a lot less powerful than they used to be.
So I know one of your research projects involves looking at podcasts, and in particular, the impact of podcasts on our politics. And obviously, I have an interest in this as a podcaster, so I'm interested to hear more about this research.
I have been, I think, into podcasts for a while as a geriatric millennial. That's been something that I've been somewhat attuned to from the early days where you would just listen to NPR shows through iTunes. But now, obviously, there's probably as many podcasts as there are listeners, right? And it's kind of like with academic papers, I think, like a median podcast has an audience of like 5, but very few are very powerful. And that is something that is really understudied in academia. A lot of research has really focused on social media and traditional media, even entertainment media. But podcasts have really been flying under the radar. What motivated me to look into this, and it just tended to work out in a way that it seemed to have quite a profound impact on our just recently concluded presidential election with the manosphere and whatnot that we can talk about in more detail. But essentially what motivated me is a very simple insight, and that is that Joe Rogan is somebody who gets about 15 million listens for an average episode. And just to give you an idea of how much that is, and you know, the numbers are unconfirmed because it's from Spotify and they don't really have an interest in revealing that information. But all the estimates suggest like 11 to 15 million, usually closer to 15 than 11. When we compare that to the most popular cable news shows, right? So Fox News is the most successful cable news network. Prime time, so shows like Hannity are the most popular on that network. So the most popular shows on current affairs on cable get at the most about 4 million. 4 million. So this is multitudes more, right? And it's been flying under the radar. So I've been wanting to understand more about podcasts in general, but Joe Rogan specifically, because I think there's something to him that I'm originally from Poland, and some of my friends in Poland like listen to Joe Rogan. This is not just an American phenomenon. I think this is a global phenomenon. And there's something to the fact that in an age of a decreasing attention span, somebody who puts out 3.5 hour episodes gets that kind of listenership. So because of the fact that we don't know a lot, what me and some of my colleagues wanted to look at first is just trying to understand just the audience composition. And the audience of Joe Rogan tends to be younger, tends to be male. That makes sense. Tends to be a lot more conspiratorial than like your average person, and tends to just generally be distrustful of traditional institutions. And I think that squares with kind of now how we perceive the impact of these shows on our politics and just our social life in general.
How did Rogan achieve this status? And I'm not looking for answers so I could blow up my audience. But I am very interested in this. I mean, he's a comedian. I remember watching him on news radio. How does a comedian essentially get that sort of audience?
He is, I think, a skilled interviewer. He creates an environment where people feel like they're just talking to a friend, right? I think because of the fact that he is a comedian, but also he's very embedded in the mixed martial arts world, right? So I think when you look at it historically, a lot of the episodes were really, here's some MMA fighter, here's my comedian friends. And they were just kind of talking about their shared interest in that with some added kind of signaling masculinity type of, like if you encountered a bear in the woods, how would you, kill it with your bare hands type of thing, signaling their manhood. But that was really most of it in the beginning. And then only more recently did he start taking more political positions. And I think the reason why the show became popular, I mean, there's probably not a single story, but I think it does fit nicely with the timeline of big epidemic of loneliness, especially among young men. If you look at statistics among young American men, they're struggling, right? They're not doing as well in school as young women are doing. They are a lot lonelier on all kinds of surveys. Joe Rogan creates this kind of parasocial relationship, right?
Parasocial, tell us what that
So,
word
so
means.
it's essentially you treat the host as a friend, right? You view that person as your friend, that you know them. You're looking forward to an episode. You feel like they know you, right? Even though it's very much one directional, but the way it's coming into your ear, it's creating this space like, I'm just talking to my friend, talking to his friend, right? So I think that fills a certain void in young men, which I think is why men are so much more likely to listen than, for example, women. I think that's only part of the story, but I think that's a big part of why it is so popular now.
As a scholar, how are you studying this phenomenon? What's your method, I suppose? You're listening to
Right.
lots of episodes, I assume.
Yes,
But
which comes at a cost sometimes. A lot of what I do is surveys, but we have been doing work with very computationally skilled colleagues who are essentially, we're trying to tackle it from different directions. Surveys of audiences is a big part of it. Another is looking at transcripts and content and utilizing computational social science methods. So trying to kind of see who are the guests, what are the networks of guests. So that's the Manscaped part, because a lot of the people are kind of recycled in the Theo Von podcast and some of these other podcasts, right? There's certain characters appear over and over again, and those are the kind of influencers for this population. So looking at kind of network analysis and which guests kind of pop up, what are they talking about? So in a longer term, we're trying to map at which point do politics enter the fray, what politics are signaled, because we think ultimately Joe Rogan is very powerful because he's not viewed as political, right? People frequently tune in because of the MMA, comedy, to some extent politics now, but historically the audience wasn't tuning in for politics. So we are in an age where a lot of people are turned off by politics because of all the polarization, all the kind of negativity you see. So you're tuning in for entertainment, and you view Joe Rogan as an entertainer. He's going to talk to his comedian friends, his MMA friends. When then he launders in some politics into that becomes incredibly persuasive because people's partisan guards aren't up, right? When you ask people what kind of source they get their information from about politics, they don't list Joe Rogan as politics, right? They list that as entertainment. So because of that, I feel like there's a lot of persuasion potential because they don't view him as a political actor. So that means whatever he says is not met with the same partisan guard as when Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow or Anderson Cooper, any kind of anchor or a host or whatever, is trying to say. I think that's really where the persuasive power of podcasts might be really powerful, because a lot of these podcasts are not explicitly political, but they do end up talking about politics quite a lot. So what I'm trying to do is trying to understand how much they're talking about politics and what topics, in what way, and then trying to understand what effect then that might have on their audiences.
I read some analyses that suggested that Trump's appearance on Joe Rogan's program just before the election might have been decisive in turning the election in his favor. Is that true? Has your research borne that out? Or
I don't have any research that can directly confirm this, but if we work from the assumption that our elections are inherently very, very close these days, right? And even an election, not this previous one, but in 2020, right? Joe Biden won about 7 million more votes, but it really was about 500,000 votes in certain key states that swung the election. When we think of it that way, we're talking about less than 1 million people can really decide the election in certain states. Can a podcast have that persuasive power? Like, probably could, right? Because it could have motivated certain groups, especially young men, to actually turn out to vote. So, I don't want to say that it definitely impacted it, but I think it could, because our elections are so inherently close. Our country is so divided that it really could matter. And I think it was a mistake that Kamala Harris didn't go on a show like that, because it reaches exactly the kind of population that I think Democrats would have wanted to at least make a case towards.
You co-authored an article, Who Shares Conspiracy Theories and Other Misinformation About COVID-19 Online? And I'm interested to hear about your findings in this article.
A lot of the work that is focused on the misinformation space tends to focus on understanding the features of misinformation and who believes it and why, but less is done on sharing. And we think with my co-authors, sharing is actually quite important, because you contribute to virality of misinformation. You see it, and if you choose to share it, even to quote unquote dunk on it, right, and to say like how stupid it is, that contributes to its virality. It feeds the algorithm. It tells the algorithm that it's something that you want others to show, and it amplifies it. So we wanted to look at what factors motivate sharing, and we were in a position to field work during COVID in 5 Anglo countries. So we did US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand. We didn't really expect a lot of differences because those are ultimately fairly similar countries. And what we found was actually a certain form of American exceptionalism. Americans were just as likely as Brits, as Australians, as New Zealanders to actually encounter misinformation online. But we were 3 times more likely to actually share it. That was a pretty striking finding to us. We can only speculate about why that's the case, but we think it's partly because of how politicized COVID has become and the fact that our political elites in our country, to a certain extent, they themselves have spread certain forms of misinformation in COVID, and that kind of gives people then a go-ahead to engage in that kind of behavior as well. We noted that certain things made people more likely to share, and one of those things was kind of populist attitudes. And unfortunately, in recent decade or so, maybe a little more, our politics have taken that populist turn. So we are kind of a ripe ground for, unfortunately, this type of news consumer behavior where you just amplify and share misinformation, partly because you agree with it, but frequently not because you agree with it, but because you want to signal your partisan allegiance, your identity. This is something that your team believes in, and you want to signal that to others because social media is the space where a lot of people who are really into politics signal their allegiances. That's who is on social media. People who are more extremely partisan, people who are much more ideological. That's the kind of behavior that you engage in when you encounter misinformation. This is something that my site supports. And whether you believe it or not, it's really secondary. It's more about identity signaling.
So if Americans are more likely than others, at least in the survey, to share misinformation and other such stories, that suggests to me that maybe it's not something inherent in the technology. It's a cultural or political difference that maybe trumps anything in the algorithm.
I think that's to a certain extent true. Technology helps, right?
Indeed.
Because it is very hard. I'm old enough to remember when Facebook didn't have a feed. If me and you were friends on Facebook, I would have to go on your page to see whether you posted anything. There was no unified feed, endless scroll. That is a fairly recent kind of development. Just the mere existence of that and the fact that it's not just chronological content of people you share, you are contacts with, but it is just content that the algorithm thinks you like. That on its own contributes to it. But I think it is very much a feature of our politics. And I think, sadly, it is a feature of our politics that we export to other places because that then is very much mirrored. I mentioned I'm from Poland, and like a lot of our culture wars, a lot of our discourse on social media then gets picked up there and fuels similar types of disagreements there. So we set that agenda worldwide increasingly these days because of how small the world is on places like Twitter or Facebook or TikTok.
So speaking of misinformation, you've authored another article, Sick as a Dog, the Prevalence, Politicalization, and Health Policy Consequences of Canine Vaccine Hesitancy. And I'll confess, until we sat down for this interview, I had never heard of canine vaccine hesitancy.
Yes, that is something that me and the co-authors on this project, one of them is Matt Mata, who is my frequent co-author and friend, and we do a lot of work together on vaccine hesitancy related to human vaccinations.
Humans, yeah.
And our third co-author is actually a veterinarian, and we were actually talking, and she was sharing her experiences. That's what led us to think that would be interesting to try to measure this because we haven't been exposed to really any research on this topic. So we were in a field with a large nationally representative survey, and we thought, let's try to tap into this, see how prevalent that is. And unfortunately, it is fairly prevalent. It is something that we found at least 53% of Americans have at least some form of canine vaccine hesitancy expressed, whether it's through viewing canine vaccinations as unsafe and leading to neurological diseases like autism, whether it's viewing vaccines as just generally unsafe or unnecessary. We think it's the kind of finding that is troubling for many reasons, not just because it affects dogs, because then we're able to tell that people who are vaccine hesitant, canine vaccine hesitant, are less likely to actually vaccinate their dogs. So we do have certain herd immunity requirements for things like rabies that can jump from animals to humans, and that is a very deadly disease. So it's not just the kind of study where you get that catchy finding and you're like, well, yes, that's troubling, but so what? The so what is actually quite important. And we think that part of the reason why is COVID has been so politicized and the COVID vaccination has been so politicized that we now see it spill over to these other things. So things like dog vaccinations, canine vaccinations, things like other vaccines that previously have not been politicized, like the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination. I've had some studies in 2019 when measles outbreaks were happening around the country where we found that there was no big partisan difference in attitudes towards measles vaccinations. And in fact, a lot of Republican politicians were very much pro-vaccinations, like Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, who's a medical doctor, were very vocal proponents of vaccinations. So the several years of COVID really altered the landscape, and now we're seeing consequences being spread over well beyond COVID and well beyond human vaccinations, apparently, spreading to dog owners. And some research has come out since, apparently cat owners as well.
This is obviously important research, and I'm certain it's appeared in a scholarly journal of some significance. But I also note that this article was taken up by the worldwide media and also appeared on Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live. You have to tell me more about this.
They don't really tell you. So imagine our surprise watching SNL one day when Michael Che put an image of a dog behind him and essentially made a pun about dog autism. So that was definitely an accomplishment that we didn't really anticipate having, but I think I might have to start putting that on my CV.
So in addition to being on Saturday Night Live, which is quite an achievement, in addition to your scholarly work, do you engage in public scholarship? In other words, do you want these findings to have policy or public implications of some kind?
Sure. And I think as academics, we frequently are in a position where we produce work that gets read by our peers, and those peer groups are not very large. I have made an effort since I was a PhD student to try to translate my findings to the broader public. So I do try to engage in public scholarship through public-facing op-eds and these types of things, as well as media interviews, appearances, trying to explain things that I have expertise on to the broader public. It does come with a cost, especially in my experience. The work on vaccines in particular definitely produces somewhat of a backlash. So if you are a scholar who's thinking of doing this, you should be aware of the fact that this is something that you might get some pushback from the public from. But I think the pros outweigh the cons in a sense that I think if you can actually make a contribution that's empirically driven, you have an expertise in, I think it's definitely worth to be doing that because we need that in our point in time right now.
At what stage in your life did you realize that you were going to be a communications scholar?
The answer is actually quite complicated because I have technically become, quote-unquote, communication scholar August 1st when I joined OSU School of Communication, because my prior appointment was at Colorado State University, where I was in the political science department, and my PhD is actually in political science, but my work has always been fairly interdisciplinary and at this nexus of political and science communication. So I made that jump to OSU primarily because of the fact that it's a great fit, it's a great institution. We have great colleagues, but also great graduate students to work with. But I was hovering on that border, and calling myself a communication scholar per se is something that is fairly new. In terms of when academia became a thing I wanted to pursue was, I think, when I took a media and politics class in my undergraduate education. I'm an immigrant. I didn't really think I would go to college. And when I did, it never really occurred to me that being a professor is a job that could be available to somebody like me. The topic of the class, as well as the professor, really kind of sparked that interest in me. He ultimately ended up hiring me as a research assistant. That's when I learned this is a career that you can have. And that really sparked the journey for me. So it was a combination of the topic being very interesting, but also an influential professor who then made that push. Without his push, I don't know what I would be doing right now. Probably go to law school or something, but definitely not this.
This research interest on how the public gets their information, why did you settle on that broad research agenda as opposed to something else? There's so many other problems that you could be addressing. What drew you to this?
What initially drew me to this, other than just the broad power that the media have, what really drew me to the specific set of issues like vaccines and climate change was the fact that those are exactly the kind of issues where the media play a powerful role. Most people don't read the New England Journal of Medicine. Most people aren't medical doctors, don't have that expertise, are not PhDs who study climate science. So we need the media for these types of issues. They need to translate findings from scholars from universities like ours to the broader public. And that translation is very important. What really interested me is the fact that those issues really, there's nothing political about vaccinations or climate ultimately, but they are political. So how does it happen that we take a scientific issue and it becomes a political issue? And what role does the media play in that? That really is what drove my work in my dissertation and ultimately most of my work ever since.
What are you working on now? What's next for your research?
So I'm doing more on podcasts. So trying to understand Joe Rogan and beyond is a big part of my agenda. And another big project, big kind of line of work is building on my work on vaccine hesitancy, not canine, human vaccines. And the bulk of this work is centered on a National Science Foundation grant with some other scholars where we look at how local and state public health agencies communicate about vaccines. So we're trying to understand how have they communicated about all kinds of vaccines, then experimentally testing which messages work. So that's what we're in the middle of right now. And then the final step of this project is working with a marketing firm and actually tailoring specific communities with the messages that we found in our survey experiments that work. So targeting specific communities with those messages and seeing whether we can actually move people in their real life. So the field experiment beyond just an online survey experiment. Just trying to see whether these messages are actually persuasive when we deploy them in the real world.
Well, delighted you were on this podcast.
Thank you so much.
Dominik, Stecula, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.